Okay. Hi, this is my name is Jeff Esterly. I work for the Army Corps of Engineers, and this is part 3 of the Kentucky Education for Dam Safety, the KEDS workshop, which is a Silver Jackets partnership. And so this is following along with the part 2, which is emergency action plans, and this goes into kind of a mock exercise, so to speak, of an actual dam failure event. So it's somewhat fictional, although it is based upon an actual dam failure event of the Edenville and Sanford dams. So I just want to have a bit of a disclaimer because I kind of pieced this together from news articles. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission did do a forensics after action type of a report that I'll show there at the end. I pulled a lot of information from that. But maybe the timelines don't follow exactly along. And I'm not going to say that I'm getting all of the facts exactly correct because I wasn't involved in this event or this dam failure, and I don't work for those agencies. So I think everything in here is more or less true and factual, but just a disclaimer that some things might not be exactly correct. So just kind of giving a little background in on the dams, kind of setting the stage. These dams are in Michigan. On the Tittabawassee River. So up in the picture of Michigan, if you look to see it flows into Lake Huron. Edenville Dam was built in 1924, so that's the upstream structure. Sanford Dam is downstream, built in 1925, and they are 2 hydropower dams, and they are both regulated or were by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that's the FERC, located on the Tittabawassee River. And they were sold in 2004 to Boyce Hydro, and actually, so this is one of the parts I'm not sure, so I don't know if this was recognized before the sale. I think it probably was, but these 2 dams did not have the adequate spillway capacity. So the FERC or FERC has a rule that they want their licensees to be able to pass the probable maximum flood or the biggest storm that is estimated that could occur on that watershed upstream of that dam. Hydropower dams are designed to be full most of the time. They don't have a flood risk management mission, so they don't store waters. Hydropower dams want to be as full as possible the majority of the time to facilitate hydropower generation. So that's how they operate those dams. But these spillways on the dam were estimated that they were only large enough and they could only pass about half of that big storm upstream in the watershed, the PMF, only about half of it. And so half of that PMF was estimated to be somewhere around a 1 in 500 annual chance exceedance storm in that watershed. So during this time, the owner, the Boyce Hydro, was not following the direction of the FERC, and they had not done the remediation to increase the size of the spillways or do other modifications to the dam in order to be able to pass the PMF. And so through this process, this regulatory process of trying to get the licensee to comply, they're non-compliant, probably because these were potentially marginally producing hydropower projects. They're pretty old. So maybe they're just not the correct capital investment to make. I don't know what all went into that decision, so I probably shouldn't speak too much to it. But basically, the FERC pulled the license because they did not remediate as ordered, and that was considered non-compliance. And so they pulled the license, which means that the state of Michigan then took control of the dams in 2018. So just a little bit closer, Google Earth shot. Now showing some of the populations downstream. So Edenville Dam had about 500 folks living directly downstream. Sanford Dam has about 800 folks living directly downstream. And then there's the bigger community of Midland, which is about 42,000 individuals living in Midland. Just a few more facts of the 2 upstream communities. So Edenville is in the county of Midland, and the city there is located 3/4 of a mile below the dam. The population has about 2,500, a little more than 2,500. Most of those folks live around the lake and not directly downstream. That's about 500, and I think they were referring to that as the village, or the little community directly downstream. And then Sanford is in Jerome Township, so a different township but the same county, the county of Midland. and it's immediately downstream of Sanford Dam and has that population of about 859. And then Midland is the county seat of Midland County. So I think this all worked out fairly well for the county emergency manager. I think that's probably one of the reasons why things went fairly well for this event. But it is located about 10 miles down below the second dam, Sanford Dam, with that population of a little less than 42,000. But it's also the headquarters of Dow Chemical, and they are situated mostly around the river and have some settling ponds and some other facilities where they're probably drawing some water and discharging some water, doing some other things. So obviously that's a concern for flooding right along the banks of the river. Okay, so in September 25th of 2018 is when the FERC took its regulatory action and pulled the license for Edenville and Sanford dams, and the state of Michigan took that regulatory control. And still, you know, these dams at that time could not pass the full PMF. They only passed half the required extreme flow, that PMF storm, and it is estimated the dam could pass that only the 1 in 500 storm event. And so as you can see from the news article to the right, you know, when this news comes out, so this is right when this happened, it's in the news, people now know that, hey, the FERC pulled the license for this licensee on these 2 dams, and they can only pass a 1 in 500 storm event. So I'm not sure if the folks downstream can appreciate, you know, the magnitude of 1 in 500 storm. You know, I think this river had some other lesser storms prior to that, but never had that 1 in 500, because remember, these dams have been there since 1924 and 25, so they've never seen this 1 in 500 storm event. But the initial reaction for everybody around the lake is probably what you could expect, that, you know, maybe they're not so worried about dam failure, dam failure consequences to the folks downstream. You know, what are some of the folks worried about? I shouldn't say all, but at least the folks live around the lake. You know, there's the verbiage of this news article: future control of lake levels on Wixom Lake has become a serious concern. So lake levels, they want to know if they're going to have their lake. They have lake houses. They want to maintain somewhat of a consistent lake level for their recreational benefits. And so that is a big concern. There's a lot of property. There's a lot of tax dollars that flow through from recreation and everything, and property values and such. So it is a concern. Less, but maybe the immediate concern is a little bit less of what could happen if the dam failed. But I do have the bullet there. So at this point, you know, try to think about, you know, what actions would be prudent for the residents who live along the river, what actions are prudent for the EMs of Midland County, and then those first responders. So if you see this in the news and if you live along the river downstream, or you are a first responder, if you're an EMA in that area, you know, what actions might you be thinking about taking, you know, given this news? So this just happened, they pulled the license, and now this news has kind of more or less hit the streets. So what I would think of, if you're a resident, you think, first off, well, where's my property in relation to these potential inundation zones? Maybe you think that from high river flows or a potential dam failure. So that kind of comes into, you know, what's your distance to the river? Do you live right on the river bank? If you do, you're probably used to high river flows, and you pay attention to the river, things like that. If you live a little bit farther away and you've never seen any potential inundation come your way, you've never been threatened by river flows, maybe that's not necessarily entering your mind. And on the right is a FEMA firm map that all areas can get the FEMA firm maps for their watershed if it's a large enough watershed. I don't think these are produced for all rivers and streams, but most of them is that typically will only have the 1 in 100 or the 1 in 500. It doesn't have dam failure inundation zones, which are much larger than those 2 events in most cases. And up to this point, most agencies, federal agencies and state agencies, have not released inundation maps to the public. That's changing, so that's the emphasis of the resources presentation of this workshop. So we want to emphasize that the Corps is now putting our inundation maps out for public consumption. A lot of the states are doing the same thing. So Kentucky State and Indiana State regulatory agencies are making their mapping available to the public. And again, that's in the resources section of the slides. But at this point, but FERC has not done that, and they didn't do it. They haven't done it now, and they weren't doing it in 2018 to the time the dams failed. So if you wouldn't have that information necessarily at your hand, so you'd be maybe in a little bit of a guessing game, so am I in an inundation zone or not? So should I prepare for an evacuation, or should I prepare to help my neighbors? If I do need to evacuate, where do I go? What are my evacuation routes? Where am I going to go if I do heed a flood warning? Do I need to go to the county shelter that might be set up if a bad enough event happens? Do I have neighbors, family I can go to? Those are the things that I would maybe be thinking of if I was a resident who lived downstream of these structures. But the biggest thing that I always think of is, do I need to heed the warning? So if you got a warning, if one came through the news, if that the dams were in trouble, well, is that me or not? So without the actual inundation mapping available to you, you might be hard pressed to make a very defined and good judgment call on that. But if you're the emergency managers, you do have these maps. So all federal agencies and state agencies have given the mapping with the emergency action plans to county officials, other local EMAs, people with a need to know, first responders. They've always been available to those individuals and different agencies with counties and states and cities. So they do have that information. And so the city of Midland had this flood map on the right. It does have fair weather dam failure and worst case dam failure in there. It also has some of the more of the flood levels that you'll see at the NOAA website that they refer to as action stage, flood stage, intermediate flood stage, major flood stage. So they've got different colors on there. So the County of Midland looks like they were prepared. They knew where the floodwaters were going to go to the best of their ability, the best modeled mapping that they had, and they were fairly prepared for that. So they did have that. So in this case, the emergency managers, they did have that proper inundation mapping. If this was a different dam, a different place, and you're an EMA, I'd be thinking, do I have that mapping? Where is it? Can I use it in a timely manner? How do I incorporate that into other plans that I have for my city or my county? Do I have an all hazards plan? Do you have GIS coverages? Or do you need to use paper atlases, and maybe you can pull out the sheets that impact your area the most and have those readily available to yourself at that kind of local community level? And then I'd be thinking, can I execute the plan with the resources on hand? So emergency managers, as I've said earlier, they have the evacuation authority, so they have to pre-plan. Do they have enough police officers or firemen or volunteer firemen or state police or somebody else they can call in, wherever they get the resources for? Do they have them available, and are they can they use them? And then where are your shelters? Are they pre-planned? Are your shelters that you've set up for all hazards, are they in a floodplain? And maybe they're not in a very low-lying floodplain, but are they kind of on an upper flood bench that could be inundated from a dam failure? But most floods, they wouldn't be. So those are the things that I would be thinking about and looking at if you're an emergency manager or a local responder. Okay, so that's just when the news came out. So everybody hears, hey, there's these dams, there's a big problem, they can't pass this flood. Okay, well, they've been there since 1924, 1925, so maybe I shouldn't be too worried. But here we come, we're flash forwarding now a couple of years, a year and a half or so to May 18th, 2020, and now the storms are coming. There's heavy flooding going on most of central Michigan. There is 7 inches of rain forecasted for the Tittabawassee River Basin, and that storm has been estimated that it's going to produce river flows near that 1 in 500 chance level, or 1 in 500 chance storm is coming. And so what actions then would be prudent? So now, you kind of heard in the news that maybe this big flood could come, it could cause a dam failure, but now you're hearing in the news that this storm is actually coming. And you're probably seeing it raining because it's been raining for a while. So what actions now are prudent? Kind of the same thing. So the residents along the river, now you're really, ramping up your efforts to, secure your property, evacuate to someplace else. If you're in the inundation zone or you're near the inundation zone, the emergency managers are probably now calling in those resources, organizing those resources, starting to think about how am I going to execute this evacuation plan if I need to. Same with the first responders, talking to the AMAs, how are they organized? What do they need to do? So just in the news article, roads closed across mid-Michigan counties due to flooding. So things are really starting to ramp up, and that big storm is forecasted. Okay, so then we're going on to kind of the next day. So May 19th, 2020 at 5 a.m., the flood levels now on the river have reached 26.5 feet. Anything over 24 feet is considered flood stage. And now there's a lot of flooding going on, probably upstream and downstream of the dam. And at about 6:50 a.m., Midland County Emergency Management determines the dams are structurally sound, but the dams cannot control or contain the water, and AEM officials began evacuation. So I have a little asterisk. So when I first put this together in this timeline, I had that there, but just kind of remember when the evacuations begin, and I'll kind of go over lessons learned at the end. So this is about the time when the flood levels got big enough. You can see the picture on the right where this is the Edenville Dam. It is completely full to the rim, passing quite a bit of water through its gated outlet works there at the center of the embankment, sending that water downstream. So again, now I'm kind of thinking, what actions are prudent for residents, EMs, and first responders. So now really you're putting those plans in action. So if you, had thought about what you might do earlier, you maybe solidified a plan, now is the time where you're putting those plans into action and you are evacuating these potential inundation zones. May 19th, 2020 at 5 p.m. Now this flood alert goes out to the Midland area, Edenville Dam on the Tittabawassee River, flooding US 10, which is closed. This put pressure on the Sanford Dam downstream. So they are announcing now, and this is 8 p.m., so kind of think about that. So at 8 p.m., the failure warning goes out. Some emergency texts start going out, warning people to evacuate. So again, I just kind of have the same bullet, but in the previous slide at that point in the event, we talked about putting people's actions and moving on forward with those plans. And now hopefully people have already executed their evacuation plans, or they're moving forward with all of those types of responses. So I have some time-lapse pictures. So this is from somebody's cell phone camera that was standing kind of on the left abutment of the dam. And so these are stills that came off of that video. I think the video is on YouTube. If you Google it, you could probably find it. And these are just kind of going through time steps, how the dam failed very quickly. So on the previous slide, we talked about that, the dam tenders thought that everything was okay. I think they really thought that the storm was ending, the lake was cresting, river levels were going to begin to fall pretty soon, and they were going to make it because that flood level was right there at that 1 in 500 event, and they thought everything was going to be okay. But here we are. It will start at 0 seconds on the left-hand picture. You can see already in this first still image that there's water flowing down the slope of the dam, the downstream slope of the embankment, and the crest is a little bit depressed. You can actually, if you barely see that kind of like shadowed kind of brown area, that's actually the soil starting to kind of shear and form a depression. So the crest is collapsing. There's water coming over the top of the dam. In the second shot, you can see that the crest has collapsed more. You can see now there's a bulge forming on the downstream toe of the slope. It's getting very large. If you look at the left-hand picture and kind of squint, you can see maybe a little bit of a bulge even starting to form there. So that's typically how you'll see slope failures occurring, whether they're rapid or slow, that you'll get a soil bulge at the toe accompanied by some type of depression or sinkhole farther up the dam near or on the crest. So right-hand picture at 6 seconds. Now we're just moving on to 7 seconds. Bulge is bigger, crest is collapsing. 1 second intervals, this all happens pretty quick. So this is all slumping and kind of flowing out across the toe of the dam. So here we are at 15 seconds. Now a lot of this soil, very heavily saturated, is starting to spread out, almost kind of a pancake manner there. And then here comes in the right-hand section at 28 seconds, you're already starting to see a gush of water flowing through this breach and embankment from the reservoir. So now at 36 seconds, I don't know if he stepped back a little bit because whoever was videoing was getting a little bit nervous. So they stepped back a little bit. Now you can see the breach has collapsed pretty fully. Nice flow of water coming out through that breach, starting to empty the reservoir. And then at 6:24 p.m., that right-hand picture, the dam has fully breached, starting to widen somewhat. That breach is eroding and widening, and more flow going through the breach. But you see here that timestamp of 6:24 p.m., and I pointed out on the previous, or a few slides previous, that the dam failure warnings went out at 8 p.m. So that's an hour and a half, after the failure, which seems like a long time, and I think it probably kind of is, but in some ways, maybe not so much. It takes a while for, if this was just a citizen, I'm sure they had dam tenders out there watching this dam, people kind of watching it, but it takes a little while for these warnings to go through, and maybe that was because they thought everything was going to be okay. They thought they were going to make it. I'm not really sure. Like I said earlier, I wasn't directly involved, so I don't have all of the details on the response, but there we are, fully breached at Edenville Dam. 7:13, just another time shot. You can almost see like the tailwaters rising now with the amount of water that's being pumped out. Again, more full erosion now, but at 9 o'clock time stamp, full breach. So this is just something that I always think about, when I'm working on EAPs or we're doing exercises with the county and state EMAs and project folks that we do here. Will our warnings be heeded? And a lot of that goes to that availability of the inundation maps, So if people have that information in their hands and they can find out that they're the ones that are directly impacted, then perhaps we can increase our response, our evacuation response when we put out these warnings and we have incidents and potential failures. So just reading some of this verbiage here from these news articles that I pulled. We had a lot of rain. The river was already flooding. This was nothing new. Everybody was like, we've done that drill. It happened 3 years ago. Babineck said over the sound of ambulance sirens, but here we are. The fireman says, the dam is breaking, life-threatening, leave now. When the water was rising, we thought we could ride it out, Cooper said, pausing to work in the heat. Then we had a lake on all sides and made the decision we can't stay. I had to call 911. My wife, Karen, she struggles walking with hip and joint pain after surgery. She's not really able to walk out with a cane. 2 men carried her out. So they waited to heed the warning until it was right on their doorstep. But I don't know what they did before that. Hopefully they at least made some arrangements. Maybe it sounds like they didn't, and they were just lucky that they were rescued by the first responders because they were on top of their game. But maybe these 2 individuals maybe weren't. They had heeded the warnings. Another one, somebody was banging on the front door. Mike Desko and his wife, Jen, who lived in Beaverton, had just fallen asleep. My neighbor, Big Frank, came pounding on my door. He said the dam broke. We had 40 minutes to get out. So then it goes on to talk about Jen. She's tired. She had a long day. She's been dealing with COVID and COVID response and things like that. And he was like, no, I don't think I'm going anywhere. I've heard this story before. So, those are the type of things that we kind of hear a lot. And until that risk is staring them in the face and they can see that water creeping up their property toward their residents, maybe some people are hesitant to respond. And that is a understandable reaction in a lot of ways. People want to protect their property. They don't, maybe they don't have the resources to expend and evacuate. That's not something that everybody can do. Like in some of these stories, people have medical conditions, so getting that inundation mapping out there before the event so people can see and visually see that it's potentially impacting, I think will have a lot of benefits going forward if that is properly communicated and distributed to the folks who need to know. The right hand, just a tweet that went out there. So this is probably during the event. So that was May 19th at 10:30 p.m. So that was the night before. So what will flooding extent look like in Midland? So County GS has a dam failure layer. So that was part of the piece of the one that I showed you earlier. But I don't know if this person was necessarily with the county. They may have access to a county GIS system. So in the top left of the screen, I can see Midland County GIS. So there are a lot of communities out there that have GIS sites that the general public can go to and look at all kinds of different hazards or different information they can get. So this would be something good that they could do as well, pulling this information from a core site or a state site or wherever they need to get it from. Okay, So kind of moving along with the timeline, at 8 p.m. on the night of May 19th, Sanford Dam overtops and fails. Residents start arriving at Midland High School after being evacuated. The governor, Gretchen Whitmer, has declared a state of emergency for Midland County. Next morning, 4 a.m., the National Guard arrives. So typically when the National Guard arrives, now you're in recovery mode. It takes a while to mobilize those resources. They're starting their mission to kind of help people out. But there's still some flood fighting going on. So you can see there the 6:35 timestamp, Poseyville dike breaks. Midland County Central Dispatch sends out an alert urging residents on Ashby between Poseyville and Patterson Roads to evacuate. So, the dams have failed. Well, the second one's just now failing there at 8 p.m. the night before. So that failure wave needs to go down. There's still a lot of water in the watershed from the storm event that's emptying out. So still a lot of things going on. I think I have a picture in the next slide. Well, no, this slide is just some overviews of the failures, just to kind of put things in perspective. So these are not exactly during the event, just kind of showing some of the aftermath. So Edenville Dam on the left, Sanford Dam on the right. So you can see kind of the impacts. And for Sanford Dam, the lower picture is a little bit after the water's evacuated. So now some of the eroded and damaged embankment that breached and failed is starting to kind of show itself. Looks like there was some concrete slabs on the downstream side and things like that probably protecting the embankment from erosion from discharge from the gates. But just kind of seeing some of the aftermath for the dam failures. And then, so this is like Midland County flood plan after dam failure. So it sounds like Midland County partnering with Dow to have that response. So these are the actions they're taking to try to lessen the failure impacts downstream. Talks about the safe shutdown of operating units and evacuating all but essential staff from Dow. And I believe that lower left picture there is the Poseyville dike. So that looks like a sandbag closure across the street they have for a type of a local flood protection or levee system that they have. And again, I talked earlier about road closures, trying to keep people out of flooded streams, bridges, water all the way up to the bottom bridge cord, obviously not safe to travel on that bridge. So still a lot of things for emergency management, community, local responders and things to kind of respond to at this point. So again, we talked about Dow a little bit, but obviously concern about toxins and things coming from Dow. So I'm sure Dow had a pretty good flood plan to take, cooperated with the city on that, city and the county. And then that one on the right, pretty phenomenal. Thousands evacuated before Midland area dam burst with no lives lost. And you have to say that was a pretty good outcome. And it is kind of phenomenal. So, maybe there's a couple instances of luck involved in there, but I think overall, the county did a very good job responding. So 10,000 residents evacuated, no fatalities. Notifications were timely and warnings were taken for the most part. We had a couple examples where maybe people were a little bit delayed or need to be convinced with looking at the water staring them in the face. But then an inundation mapping was prepared and was used in emergency events. So FERC does a very good job having their licensees have very well prepared and exercised emergency action plans. And so it seems like the county, as a result of that, was very well prepared. And then I have a bullet to what would have been the response if no pre-failure flooding. So what I mean by that is this dam failed during a big storm event, and the storm event occurred several days to a week prior to the dam failure. When the Corps of Engineers does our risk estimates and we estimate consequences, the percent of a life loss is much higher for what we call a sunny day storm rather than a flood storm, because if it's not raining and a dam would fail without a storm event happening, people tend to be caught by surprise. If you live along a river and you know it's raining and it's been flooding and you're used to handling flood responses and such, you're probably a lot more tuned in to the news, the weather, the warnings, and you're more prepared to take action. We take that into consideration a lot of times in our responses, but most research and events show that much higher fatalities if there is no flooding occurring before a dam failure. So this is just some notes taken from a forensics report from an independent forensics team that was put together under the direction of the FERC, the FERC. So one of the main takeaways, just a couple of things on the dam in general that aren't necessarily emergency action plan related, but with respect to human judgment, decisions, actions, and inactions during the project's history, leading up to the May 2020 event, the dam failures were foreseeable and preventable. A little bit what they mean by that. I think that's on the next slide, I have that. But the failures of the dam significantly increased downstream property damages. So when we evaluate dams and potential damage from dams, the thing we look at is the incremental damages from that. So, you know, if there is a big storm and a big flood event and there is no dam there, there are going to be damages. If there's a big flood event and the dam's there and the dam fails, what additional damages were put on those downstream communities? And here was a good example. There was definitely higher property damage because of the presence of the dams that would have happened if they had not existed. The evacuations were poorly well organized and orderly. You know, EMs attributed this in part to an exercise that was conducted in 2019. And evacuation plans developed as a result of that exercise. So I talked earlier about how the APs don't contain evacuation plans. That is the responsibility of the local, county, state EMs. But they're going to develop those plans based on the information that you're going to give them from the notifications. And so they kind of need that information and inundation mapping for sure to make those plans. So sounds like, you know, I talked about how good FERC does with their emergency action plan program. So here it paid some dividends. Now that the state was involved, they took on those responsibilities and they were carrying those forward along with the local EMAs. So overall, the emergency response to the potential and actual failures must be considered successful because there were no fatalities. So that is true. And I had that little asterisk in bold kind of earlier, and I wanted to make sure I kind of brought this up that, you know, in kind of the exercise, you know, I said when those alerts started going out, but actually the evacuations were initiated late in the evening before of May 18th and then into the early morning of May 19th because the county EM was not comfortable with what she was hearing from the dam folks. You know, I said earlier the dam tenders kind of said, well, you know, they thought they were maybe going to make it. They were going to ride it out. But I think there was a little nervousness in their voice, and she kind of tuned into that, I think, tuned into maybe some of the things that they were telling her, and she wasn't completely comfortable and decided that in order to utilize her resources to the best of her ability, she needed to start the night before in those overnight hours because she had access to volunteer firefighters. If she had waited till the next morning and into the next day, they might not have been available. And so her resources would have been severely limited. So in this case, she made a very good call that paid dividends in the end. So a little bit more about the dam I was talking about earlier, you know, that the design of Edenville Dam was not substantially inadequate if the dam had built according to the designs and plans and construction specifications. So what we do find a lot of times when we're evaluating a lot of dams, and this is pretty typical, you'll find that, you know, design went one way and then during construction, maybe construction oversight was not what it should be, something changed, something deviated, the soils that they thought they had available weren't available. In this case, the dam was compacted with much sandier material than what was in the design. And so as a result of that, this failed in a manner that, you know, is being referred to as static liquefaction. So liquefaction is typically a condition when saturated sandy soils can turn to a quick condition or lose all their strength because of some type of seismic excitement or ground motion there. So an earthquake shakes the dam, kind of excites the water and the soil in there, it separates, and those sand particles can't touch and have contact with each other, and so they slide out and kind of slough and turn a little bit liquid. So I think that's what happened here, but we didn't need the earthquake shaking. So that's something that hasn't really been observed quite before, but there was just enough of a head difference on the dam that water level got to the top of that dam. And so just, the pore water pressures from the load of the reservoir were enough to cause this liquefied state of the embankment. But if had it been constructed the way that it was assumed to have been all those years, then that shouldn't have happened. So a little bit of a not recognizing how that the construction did not follow the design. So if they had discovered that earlier, then potentially this could have been prevented. And then the downstream slope, you know, first time I saw it, I thought that it's pretty darn steep, maybe a little bit shallower slope. They could have put a berm on it. I mean, so again, if they'd used better compacted soils, slightly different design to handle those poor soils, you know, the failure could potentially have been prevented. So then just some things about the way that the dam was regulated. You know, the overall system for financing, designing, constructing, operating, evaluating, and upgrading the dams during the nearly 100 years of project history fell short in ensuring a safe dam. So what they really mean by that, and then the May 2020 dam failures, which had a bad outcome for all the parties involved, but more to the property owners downstream who only indirectly benefited from the dams and lakes, but experienced the brunt of the direct effects of the dam failure. So a little bit more on that imbalance between benefits and financial responsibility. You know, the counties, the lakefront residents, like they're the ones who are really benefiting from this recreational aspect and all the tax dollars and money that gets spent as a result of that, but they didn't necessarily contribute to paying for the cost of maintaining and upgrading the dam. So they're getting some of the benefit, but don't have to make any of the payments. But in this instance, you know, so FERC's enforcement option to help the situation, in fact, they only made it worse. So, you know, and, you know, they had to take some action, you know, but by pulling the license, then these utility can no longer generate any revenue. So if they cannot generate revenue, now there's no revenue to address the potential issues and pay for their repairs. So, and then once it got turned over to the state, you know, state and federal regulatory agencies did not have funding, programs, or staff to conduct breaching of neglected and deficient dams. And I think that's probably, you know, the case. Most state agencies, state dam safety agencies, are very short-staffed, very underfunded, and really struggle to address problems at dams where people can't afford to make the repairs. So I think that's a common issue with state-regulated dams, and in this case, a federal regulated one. So then one kind of update there. I think since we started these workshops, I didn't see this in the news, but I looked it up right before kind of the last one, but the state of Michigan is going to restore these dams at an estimated cost of $200 million and to be completed somewhere in 2025 to 2026. But that's in kind of compare that to the cost that would have been to completely remove what's left of the dam structures and restore the river and the lake bed and do all the environmental compliance. That would have cost about $120 million. So for a very small $80 million of extra dollars, they're going to get the dams and the lakes back, which will be an economic benefit to the communities. So, and that's all I have.